Hey everyone, this is Let's Play, where we cover the intersection of video games and literature. Today we are chatting with Gareth Damian Martin to chat about their writing and world building for the upcoming role-playing game Citizen Sleeper 2, Starward Vector. Thanks so much for being here, Gareth.
Hey, good to meet you.
Same here. So with the game dropping on January 31st, how are you feeling now that the game's almost out?
Yeah, pretty good. Kind of confident. Mostly just kind of hoping that time goes faster so that I can get to the point where the game actually comes out. This bit's always a bit funny. You kind of have to finish the game a bit in advance. But yeah, this right now it's more the waiting game that I'm playing.
Yeah, I'm very excited to play it. I really love the first one, and I'm curious how the next game will expand upon the ideas and the lore of the original. Did you always know that you wanted to create a sequel, and what kind of drew you back to this universe to continue exploring it?
I mean, I kind of slow walked myself into making a sequel without intentionally doing it. When I finished Citizen Sleeper 1 and it came out, the response was way bigger than what I thought was going to happen. So I started on the DLC that I kind of had planned in the back of my head just in case it went well. And then as I was working through that DLC, I had a lot of ideas kind of about things that I'd like to do that the DLC didn't really allow me to do without kind of fundamentally changing things about the game. And at the same time, I had so many conversations with people and did so many podcasts and interviews like this that kind of really helped me understand the game almost as like something that external from me. Like I gained a kind of new understanding of it. So I think when I came to the end of the DLC, I'd had so many ideas and so many discussions, and I had so many kind of leftover bits and pieces that I still felt were in my head that it just felt natural that a sequel should come out of that. And then I kind of spotted an opportunity, which was that I think I'm a big fan of the kind of like Firefly, Farscape, like ship and crew kind of story. But I'd say that story is quite a genre story for me. Like I'm not usually so kind of fully into making really genre things. But it felt like having the kind of Citizen Sleeper universe and the really established like values of Citizen Sleeper 1, that being about kind of like human experience and being very relatable, being about precarity and difficulty and human bodies. I kind of felt like it would be really interesting to take the shot at making one of those kind of ship and crew stories, but then bringing all of the Citizen Sleeper frame on top of it. And I felt that would allow me to do something that was kind of exciting or interesting within that. And so that's what got me really excited to then go, okay, I'm going to take a shot at making a sequel.
Nice. And what can you tell us about the setting for Starward Vector, and how does it relate to Erland's Eye and the events that took place there in the original game?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, Citizen Sleeper 2 is set in the Starward Belt, which is like an asteroid belt around the Helion system, which is the system that Citizen Sleeper takes place in. It's kind of mentioned in Citizen Sleeper, and a few characters, if you see their endings, like go off to the Starward Belt, which was an intentional thing in Citizen Sleeper 1, where I wanted to kind of like send some characters somewhere so that if I did want to do future things, that I had a place that was the obvious next step. The Starward Belt is quite different to Erland's Eye because it's like a group of habitats basically all across this asteroid belt, and it's kind of, so it's both kind of more sparse but has like different pockets of kind of density, different communities, and it's kind of like a wider setting for the game than in Citizen Sleeper 1. So that makes quite a big difference in terms of you'll be traveling around with a ship and you're picking up a crew, but also in terms of having like different kind of habitats like that are fundamentally like based on different ideas. So you might have like a place that's built in the remains of like one of the big installations that like Solheim built, the corporation that used to run the system. But you also might find places that are like do like mine water out of an ice asteroid, or it's just a collection of ships that have all been kind of welded together over time and become like a bigger station and things like this. So it's got a kind of more of a travelogue feel, and also more of that kind of sense of variety in terms of the locations as well.
So I know you work with talented artists and musicians on these games, but you pretty much do most of the, if not all of the writing and development yourself, correct?
Yeah, that's right. So I usually refer to myself as a mostly solo developer, because basically I'm the only person who kind of touches the game. I have Amos Roddy, who does the amazing music, and Amos like makes his music over in his studio and then sends it to me and I put it in the game. And I have Guillaume Saint-Gelon, who's the character artist for the game, and so he'll also do drawings of the characters. You send them to me and I kind of put them into the game. So everything kind of passes through me. And yeah, all the writing and the 3D art and the programming, that's all me.
So with that, what is your process for designing the narrative and the world building alongside the actual gameplay? Do you start with one before the other, or are you doing a mix of both throughout the whole development process?
Well, the kind of core of Citizen Sleeper is the rule set that's kind of based on tabletop games, like Dungeons and Dragons, or in this case, kind of more based on Blades in the Dark. But it's the whole point of using a system like that. So we use a dice system in Citizen Sleeper. Is that it kind of allows you to tell a larger variety of stories than maybe a normal video game system would. So usually in a video game, you have like a combat system, and that means if you have a combat system, you probably want most quests to have some combat in it. And that kind of limits the kind of story you can tell, right? Even if you want the character to like have a very a story that's like very human and connected with a character, they still have to fight something during that period of time. Otherwise, for the player, it's going to feel like it's not connected to the rest of the game. The point of the dice system is you can kind of use the dice to resolve any situation. So that situation might be like in Citizen Sleeper 1, kind of famously, is like babysitting a child, or it could be like salvaging a derelict spaceship, could be like working as a gang enforcer, could be working in a bar. You have this like broad variety. So I kind of purposefully design a system that allows me to tell a really broad range of stories. And that's the kind of like starting of me setting the gameplay systems up. Then when it comes to actually the writing process, Citizen Sleeper kind of, again, draws on tabletop in terms of how I write the games. So rather than kind of coming up with a really epic plot plan and trying to like plan out all these different characters and how they might intersect, I usually start with a load of character ideas that usually have a pretty clear pitch to them. Something, like a mercenary who's stranded on a space station because they've lost like the one of their crew has like stolen the drive that runs their ship or something like that. Something like, sometimes it's slightly more conceptual, sometimes it's slightly more emotional, but usually I have a kind of core of a character there. And I usually just write one scene with that character and kind of discover as I write the scene, like how I want to almost pitch them to the player, like introduce them to the player. What kind of situation might they be able to be introduced through? Because the game's text-based, it really allows me to like have characters meet much more like they would in like a TV show, right? Like they might meet in an elevator on the way somewhere. They might meet because one of them gets mugged and then someone like helps them. Or there's lots of like, you can use fairly traditional like TV writing techniques to kind of like bring characters in and bring storylines in, which is quite fun. And then once I bring the storyline in, I often write a little bit of it, and then I'll go off and work on other storylines. And I'll kind of like build the game together, like layer by layer, going all the way across all the different storylines. And if I get to a point where I don't feel I have more to kind of like add to that part of this character's story, but I know where it wants to go, I'll wait and I'll go on to something else and I'll come back and try to fill it. And so I'm always trying to give this almost improvisational story feel, almost this feeling like that you get when, if you've ever played tabletop games, but even if you haven't, it's this kind of experience where the GM, the person running the game at the table, they're kind of improvising the story for you, right? And so they're picking up on things you do in the game, and then they're trying to thread those forward or bring them back to you with a twist. Or so this is always what I'm trying to do with the writing process. It's quite a kind of like exploratory writing process, I'd say, and it's really based on following the characters. And once I develop the characters enough, they kind of they tell me where their stories want to go and where they could intersect throughout the game.
Yeah, I think the tabletop mechanics and particularly the dice rolling is such a great way to reinforce some of the themes that you're exploring in the game. I love the fact that how, as your sleeper in the first game, as they're like losing their condition, they get less and less dice rolls. And it kind of goes back to what you were talking about, like precarity, where, as you have like limited options, you sort of, your fate is much more dependent on chance than like other people who have like other resources and things like that. And I really love that sort of like parallel that you explore.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, yeah, that's kind of the core of Citizen Sleeper, is like exploring that kind of experience at the margins of, we call it like the ruins of capitalism, but like the ruins not meaning like things that are totally destroyed, but a ruin is somewhere where sometimes there's like a whole part of a arch or a wall, and then sometimes there's like a flat bit. So when you think about that in terms of like economic systems, you end up with a system where like sometimes there's functional commerce, sometimes it's completely dysfunctional, sometimes there's space, sometimes there's there's different factions coming into power and things like this. And I really enjoy exploring kind of that space where also you're really exposed to chance and exposed to the kind of forces that are playing through in the world as well.
So there's a ton of interesting lore in the first game. Do you use any interesting tools or visual methods to kind of keep track of everything while you're writing the different scenarios the player will experience?
Yeah, I mean, I'm quite freeform, and I kind of just end up keeping the whole game in my head, which is not really advisable, but I tend to find maps are the thing that are most useful for me. I am quite spatial in terms of the way I think about things, so I do tend to try to put things down on maps and try to understand things in terms of space. But yeah, I think it's that funny process of like when you write a game that's 250,000 words long, you kind of like start to completely internalize it. I mean, it takes like 2 years, and you kind of by the end, you things happen in your brain. I always say like I can sometimes just like put my brain on idle, and like ideas will happen because it's all in there. You can kind of like fix it. So I don't really have like tracking processes. I usually what happens is I start a document. I'll start a spreadsheet or something right at the beginning of a process, and I'll write down all the characters, and I'll write down like a load of things about them, and I'll maybe plot out like, okay, this event, this event, this event, this event. And then I'll never look at that spreadsheet again, because by making that spreadsheet, I've like somehow that is then like transmitted into my brain, because the process of making it is what kind of beds it in there. And then actually the effort of keeping that spreadsheet updated and live is not really worth it, because I work on my own. I don't need to communicate this stuff to anybody else. And so, yeah, I often do things just once, just to kind of bed them in. I guess it's just my kind of learning.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think I'm the same way. I think they call it like tactile learning, where
Yeah, sure.
I do that with like note taking a lot. Like if I'm reading a book and I take a lot of notes, I usually don't even have to refer to the notes ever again. It's just like the act of writing it down helps me internalize it. Yeah, that's interesting. So since the game is very text driven, do you have a particular strategy or style to your prose that you employ to make it more effective or perhaps consumable for a video game?
From the very beginning with Citizen Sleeper, a big objective was trying to make like prose work well in a video game. And I think what I discovered is prose is really powerful in video games. Very few video games use like full prose. And if they do use full prose, they're so often using it for like informational purposes, or like codex entries, or like lore entries. They very rarely have like an actual kind of literary voice to them. And so a big focus from the very beginning with Citizen Sleep, when I started writing it, was to bring a kind of literary prose to games, knowing that I think a big inspiration for Citizen Sleeper was William Gibson, who I think does this incredible job in his early work, where he kind of, he was obviously a big fan of people like Burroughs, and was really interested in quite like a modernist literary prose. But then he also wanted to tell these quite like gumshoe noirish stories. And I think he ended up with this really interesting hybrid where you got this really like stylized, heavily stylized prose that's almost falls into like extreme stylization, where you can't necessarily understand exactly what's happening, but he always manages to stay on the right side. And because of that, it's really like addictive, I find, to read. It has a really like rich detail to it, but also a lot of pace. And so that was a real marker for me. And while I don't think my natural style is kind of like Gibson, I think I'm a bit more kind of voicey. I kind of like Citizen Sleep was written in quite a like storytellery, voicey way in a weird way, but I still tried to take that kind of idea of just picking out these like really rich details, like zooming in for a moment, but just for a tiny moment, to bring in a rich detail to a scene, and then moving on really quickly and keeping things really pacey and live. And I think, you know, there's always that. I think in prose, there's this incredible like opportunity for interiority that games just can't often get to. You know, it's just hard to achieve. And so then again, that was something that I really wanted to push with the prose, is by using full prose, I have access to like the inside of the sleeper's mind. And it becomes almost a little like guided meditation, I find, because it's written in second person. I kind of have to like emotionally draw the player into specific states of mind. And I spend a lot of time thinking about how to kind of narrate the player's emotions without it feeling disjunctive to them. And it can be a really, really delicate process. But yeah, it's a big part of Citizen Sleeper is actually not just the writing, but like the particular approach to writing. And it's something that I think by working on like 2 games over now like almost 5 years has really become internalized for me, and something that I find myself like being able to, I guess, feel like I've mastered it at this point.
Nice. Wow, you're making me really even more excited to play the next one now. Was there anything in particular that you learned either during the development of Citizen Sleeper 1 or perhaps some of your earlier games or the reception to the first game that you were able to apply in Citizen Sleeper 2? I think you might have talked a little bit about this.
There's kind of 2 main parts of that. One is the understanding the sleeper more broadly. I think when I wrote the Sleeper originally for Citizen Sleeper 1, I was writing very personally, and I was kind of trying to draw on, I think again, like I was saying about trying to use prose effectively, I wanted to write something emotionally engaging, and so I knew to write something emotionally engaging, I had to draw on real emotion. I couldn't just kind of like attempt to trick the player into feeling things. I had to actually like be vulnerable myself and open up that space. And I think because of that, Citizen Sleeper 1 is a lot of me just kind of like writing really out of experience and emotion, even though it's like science fiction and it's a robot or whatever. But for me, it was like really, really drawing from things inside me. I think for Citizen Sleeper 2, because I'd then seen that and seen other people like meet me in that place of vulnerability and bring their own experiences, I felt like I understood the Sleeper as a much broader potential space for both my personal experience, but also those people's experiences. And I felt like that was something that was a really interesting thing to explore in the sequel, is being able to have that slightly more intentional way of writing the Sleeper, slightly made me able to, I hope, like sharpen some of the elements and to really like understand it a bit better. And I think one thing in particular that I understood was that the Sleeper was really like a human paradigm, and that the reason that I'd invented a robot that was falling apart was really because I wanted to talk about how human bodies fall apart. And so I think being more intentional about that allowed me again to like explore that with a little more depth and maybe nuance as I wrote it. So that was, a really important part of the process.
Nice. Do you think there's something particular about either the cyberpunk genre or like futurism or science fiction that is particularly interesting when it does come to either exploring the human condition or kind of like what you did in Citizen Sleeper 1, where you really are holding up a microscope to a lot of contemporary systems like, the economic systems, police forces maybe, and like I know like the gig economy you've talked about in the past and things like that.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I tend to think of science fiction as a kind of like refracting mirror, right? That you like you look through it and you kind of like see this strange and unusual world that allows you to like reapproach things that maybe you already knew about the world, or maybe you knew them but you kind of forgotten that they were like anybody's decision or any like they just became part of the kind of like essential qualities of your reality, right? Well, when you look at a science fiction world, it's often asking you to like look again at its own like core building blocks of a society or social interaction or technology or human experience. And I think I always found that really powerful in science fiction. And so I always think of science fiction as being about the moment in which it was written, but it's a kind of like interesting approach. I'm not really a big fan of this kind of idea that science fiction is somehow some form of prophecy, that we're like supposed to be predicting the future. I certainly, maybe some science fiction writers like to think like that. I just don't, that's not what I engage with. But I think I find some things on that side to be really powerful. I mean, a big inspiration for Citizen Sleeper is William Gibson's first ever cyberpunk story, which is called Hologram of a Fragmented Rose or something like this. It's like and it's a really beautiful, very short story about somebody who's recalling they're recalling like a relationship they had, and they're also like using this VR set to kind of like run through memories that they have, but also they can't fall asleep, so they keep running this like yoga tape on their like VR headset, and all of these things kind of mesh together and blend together. And I think that, a lot of Gibson people talk about like, oh, Gibson predicted the internet, predicted this. But I think that story is really cool because while it does kind of like point to VR or it points to technologies that might happen, there's not really what's important about it. What's important about it is the way that it represents the kind of emotional experience of processing a breakup through like a technological medium. And I don't think it matters whether that technological medium or that mediated experience is like a specific medium, like it's specifically VR or it's specifically Facebook or it's, I think what's beautiful about it is actually Gibson in that story really speaks to how we place like emotional weight into like the mediated like records of our own lives, whether that's just like a photo album or whether that's like videotapes or whether that's literally like a VR recording of your like lover's mental experience from a chip that was implanted in their head. It doesn't actually really matter. What matters is the human and emotional experience of going through that. And it means that that story hits just as hard as it did, I imagine, not that I was there when it was written. So yeah, I think that's kind of where I find myself with science fiction is it's a weird thing because I know science fiction is not really like famous for its being emotionally engaging maybe, but I think that's the side of science fiction that I find really enjoyable, is the way you can kind of shift the people's worldview, maybe get them to question some of the building blocks of their experience. But then I think also like implicate them emotionally and psychologically in the world you're building, so that when they come back to their reality, they bring something with them.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think some of my favorite sci-fi, even when it comes to books or even like movies and things like that, it's the ones, like you said, it's very much a mirror of the philosophical ideas and themes that were present at the time they were making the thing. And it's interesting to kind of see how that inform their, you know, artistic choices.
Yeah, totally.
So looking at some of the actual like gameplay footage that was released, I can see there looks to be a lot of new features related to the upkeep of your new sleeper body and how you kind of handle contracts with crew members. I think you talked a little bit about, you know, that sort of like flight crew assembly type of element, which looks really, really cool. So can you talk a little bit about some of the new mechanics that you developed and how they might be connected to this new sleeper that we're going to be embodying and maybe some of the themes of the story?
Yeah, sure. I mean, so Citizen Sleeper 2 kind of starts off with you being woken up in the middle of like a reboot process, your sleeper body, in order to break your dependence on stabilizer, which is the drug in the first game that you had to like take at regular intervals, otherwise your body would fall apart. And so we kind of intentionally start the game by creating this real disjunction with the first game, where it's like, okay, actually this like pattern that you knew, this like predictable but harrowing kind of experience of like, okay, I need to take this drug ever so often. This drug is hard to acquire. It's like you're not in that paradigm anymore. That paradigm's like taken away from you. And that's a kind of like me both setting the table narratively and also mechanically. So this sleeper is in a much more chaotic state where like they've rebooted their body and they don't really know exactly what that's going to mean, because halfway through the reboot process it was stopped, and so now they're in this kind of stage where there are like glitches, their body is like falling apart, and we represent this through the dice system. So now you have this like stress bar, and the higher the stress goes, the more likely you are to like cause damage to an individual dice. So if you have like a low amount of stress, you might roll a 1 and damage that dice. But if you have like a high amount of stress, you might roll a 1, 2, or a 3, or even a 4, and the dice will take damage. And once the dice takes enough damage, it completely breaks. And you have to then go away and repair that dice, which is something that like takes resources and time. At the same time, we also have something called glitch, which can build up in your body. So when you repair that dice, you'll build up a load of glitch because you're reintegrating like mechanical components into your body. But you can also take glitch at various other times, because throughout the game, you'll find that your sleeper body has like been altered and continues to change for reasons that you don't quite understand. And so a lot of the game is about this kind of unknowability of our own bodies in a way. You know, we feel the impact of our own bodies, and we literally cannot exist without them. You know, there is no such thing as like a mind-body split, really. Like, we are our bodies, and yet we don't really know them, and they can surprise us. And so this is a big factor in Citizen Sleeper, is this feeling of kind of unpredictability. And so with glitch, the more that glitch builds up, then when you roll your dice, they might glitch, and that turns them into a specific kind of dice that has specific effects. And so there's all of this kind of management of the dice, and the dice have become, in a way, like a much more complex representation of the sleeper's body, as the sleeper's body goes through all these kind of complex changes, and you try to deal with that. And then also, on top of that, you have the crew. And so the game structure is you kind of like go out on these high pressure contracts to get enough money to then like keep your ship running, keep your crew running. When you're on those high pressure contracts, you've got the crew that you want to take with you. You can take 2 crew members with you, and they have their own dice as well. And so each contract has this like really complex set of calculations where you're looking at the job ahead of you, and the contract itself has stress that if it builds up, like things can go worse with the contract as well. So you're trying to keep let's say it's like a big derelict spaceship. You're trying to keep that big derelict spaceship from falling apart and collapsing before you extract the component you need from it. But at the same time, you're also trying to keep your crew from getting too stressed out, but you also need to make use of their dice. And you're also trying to keep your stress low, because otherwise the longer the contract goes on, the more that you might take damage to your dice. And as you take damage to your dice, you've got less dice to work with if you break them. And so each contract is this kind of like crescendo of like intersecting factors, and you can fail all the contracts in the game, and the game doesn't like stop and go like, hey, have another go. The game's just like, okay, that happened, like let's keep rolling. And that's where the kind of storytelling comes out of. So there's a lot of layers of complexity that have been added to the game, but I think because I was able to build the first game and then build this on top, I hope that these layers of complexity kind of feel like bedded into the structure, right? They're kind of like, I know the core structure really well now, so it allowed me to find the right places, I think, to kind of get these new things in.
Awesome. One of the things I really enjoyed about the first game was the vast and diverse group of characters that you created, and how they all offered kind of like a glimpse into different ways of life, different levels of precarity, and different allegiances to some of the factions and systems that are kind of like represented in the universe that you created. So you kind of already talked about how you approach creating new characters, but were there any in particular that you either wanted to mention or that you really enjoyed writing for in Citizen Sleeper 2?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the main things that we do at the start of Citizen Sleeper 2 that's quite fun is that because you've been through this reboot process, you like lose your recent memories. And you have this character, Seraphin, who's been helping you. Both of you have been kind of kept as like debt slaves to a gang leader, and the reason Seraphin wants you to be rebooted is so you can leave, so you no longer have to rely on the stabilizer that the gang leader is basically using as a way of keeping control over you. And so when you wake up from that reboot, you've got this person with you who knows who you are and is your friend, but you don't have any memory of them. And it's quite different from Citizen Sleeper 1 in the sense that you're immediately put in this position where this character has expectations and is relying on you, but it's up to you to kind of decide like in what senses you honor that and how you relate to this person. And that was a really intentional choice to kind of start the game where the player was much more implicated with the other characters, and it wasn't just a case of like you go and find somebody and then like maybe they have some needs from you and you're trying to balance those, but instead those needs are much more apparent and immediate and tied into your experience and the story much more tightly. So I think Seraphin's a really, really important character in the story, and that's a character that I really felt like a big gamble, because when you have a character who's tied to the player, whether they like it or not, for the entire story, you kind of start to feel like, well, what if one of the players hates this guy? And so you have to like find ways to kind of take people through that journey. So that's been a really interesting process. And then generally with the crew, I think like there's a character I love, Eugene, who's like a freelancer, like really ambitious freelancer who you meet and you can get on board your crew, and he kind of brings a job with him, and talks himself up a lot. And I think that story is a really fun one because you can kind of hit a lot of tension points with Eugene, and he's not always honest with you, and there's lots of ways that story can end, and that feels quite fun because it's something that I think in Citizen Sleeper 1 everything was maybe like more agreeable maybe with a lot of the characters. Like a lot of the characters, you got to meet them, but quite a lot of them would kind of like, you have mutual interests. But I think it's interesting in Citizen Sleeper 2 to explore a bit more like having mutual interests, but also maybe some points of disjunction with the player. And just, I'll be very curious to see how players react to these characters and see if they hate them or love them or whatever in between.
Nice. So what are some of the challenges with designing a narrative that has all these branching paths and can be experienced in different order depending on, how the player plays the game? And do you have any particular methods that you use to like deal with those kind of challenges?
Yeah, it's a really complex thing to make branching narrative, and especially when it's kind of quite freeform like Citizen Sleeper is, where lots of different variables could affect other things. I think in Citizen Sleeper 1, I tried to kind of keep things fairly tight, and I worked a lot to kind of suggest potential paths without actually maybe fully implementing those, because I knew I only had a certain amount of time to make that game. But I think with the sequel, I challenged myself to actually explore a bit more of those like open-ended questions where like, hey, what if this happened and tried to like maybe, okay, well, let's offer that to the player. But the thing that I always try to do is I never want to offer a choice to the player that is not interesting. Like I don't want them to choose something and it's just like, oh, well, that means that this doesn't happen, and then the story ends. So for me, there's always that thing of like, can I do something interesting here? Is there something worth exploring? But I think in Citizen Sleeper 2, I was able to track a few more of those and to have a few more kind of slightly stranger branches happen as well, and unusual things. But I think in terms of constructing it, I actually think the only way that I could have done this game is the way that I did the game, which is slightly as an act of faith, which is to like start making it and start making the stories, find the connection points, build on what I'm writing, and actually not know where exactly I'm trying to push it towards, and just kind of feel it out. And that did definitely halfway through development, I started to feel like, am I crazy for doing this? Like for not actually knowing how I'm going to tie all these things together. But I think there's always these, I think I knew from writing the first game that there's always these really beautiful moments of synchronicity. And I think it happens a lot with writing anyway. But where suddenly you see the point where two things are going to connect. And so what I tried to do is not settle for anything less than a revelation when I was connecting stories. Like just keep pushing the story, pushing along, and try to just hold my nerve in a way. Like just keep pushing it along where I knew it needed to go. But if I didn't feel comfortable to make the decision yet, to just move away and work on something else. And in the end, I didn't really feel like I had to kind of screw through a few things together, and there was a couple of moments where things just kind of like suddenly fell in place in a kind of sequence of events, and I could kind of see like, oh, that means this all the way down the chain, and then it was like just a case of linking them all together. So yeah, that was a big part of it. I mean, I think a big part of keeping track of it and writing it has also been using a tool called Ink, a scripting language invented by Inkle, a game studio, for their games, and it has this incredibly useful ability for you to be able to query what passages in the story the player has seen, like what paragraphs, and then you can be like, oh, if they've seen this, then this, very, very easily and quickly. And so the way that Citizen Sleeper works is it means that I can kind of, in the game logic, I can have like a series of scenes, and those scenes, I don't have to change the game logic based on branching, because each of those scenes can be completely different based on decisions in the other scene. So rather than have like a really elaborate game logic, the game logic can be quite simple, but the logic within the Ink scripting is quite like complex and can like account for small variations and what information the player knows. It's a little bit of a technical thing, but it's kind of quite important to have that ability.
Yeah, that sounds really cool. Yeah, I think when writers kind of like write themselves into a corner and don't always forecast and plan everything, in advance, I do sometimes think that is palpable to like the reader and to the audience, and it can be like very excitement, like you were saying, if there is like a last minute epiphany that kind of gets you out of a jam or allows you to explore a new idea. I do think a lot of times that does translate like directly to the audience.
Yeah, I think so. And I think that's part of, I want that atmosphere for Citizen Sleeper because I want it to feel like a tabletop game. Like I want it to have that improvisational feeling, like, I want the player to feel like, oh, nobody knew that event was going to happen until it happened, right? And I agree that there's a kind of like hard to manufacture quality to those moments. But I think it's also a kind of like thing that I really prepared the ground for myself with, in the sense that Citizen Sleeper can do this because it has like the dice system, which is very, very flexible, can be used for almost any action. And it also is mostly text-based in terms of like, I don't have to, when I make like a scene, I don't have to have like animate player models and things like this. And so it means if I need to like completely change a scene, it's quite easy for me. Like if a scene takes place in a bar and then I'm like, oh, I'm going to actually move this scene to like a warehouse on a completely different location in the game, like somewhere totally different. It's just a rewrite, right? While for most games, that's like an absolute nightmare. It's like months of work. So that's also like, I wouldn't necessarily recommend the like no guardrails approach to writing a video game. But I think for Citizen Sleeper 2, I felt like I kind of prepared the ground to allow myself to do that.
I know you're interested in many different things like architecture and photography and philosophy and some things like that. How would you say some of those other interests inform your writing and your game design?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I studied puppetry for my degree. I did a PhD in poetics in like experimental literature. So I would say that the thing that connects these things is me. Like there's no real. The people often ask me this, and there's no real like rule book that I'm following, and there's not a lot of logic to it. I think I have a very broad interest range, and I get very excited about things. So I would say it's more that like my games very much come out of the same energy. I think to make a game takes a lot of time. It takes years usually. And I make games relatively fast, I would say. For most developers, I make kind of lightweight games. And for me, like I have to have that obsessive interest in the project to make it move forward. And that's the same kind of obsessive interest that got me to do like various other things and got me to do Heterotopias, which is like my architecture and games like a magazine. And like, yeah, I mean, I genuinely, it is just the feeling of like, oh, I'm excited about this way of seeing this thing, and then I kind of like go down that path. And then sometimes when you go down a path, like people start asking for more of it from you, and then it becomes like a job or a reality. And so yeah, I've always been a bit like that. I don't know if there's like a deep connection. There probably is, but in a sense I often feel like it's easier for other people to see that, because from the inside it's like, well, I'm the one doing it. It's my brain that's like organizing the information, but I don't have many insights on like on exactly how it's doing that. Sometimes, like I said, I have to just put it in idle and let the ideas come.
So I know you talked a lot about William Gibson and his influence on you. Were there any other books that were influential in deciding on the themes and the ideas that you wanted to explore in this game?
For Citizen Sleeper 2, I think like a lot of it really came out of the research, the continuance of the research and the reading I did around Citizen Sleeper 1. So there was nothing really fresh for Citizen Sleeper 2 that I felt came in terms of books. But a lot of the books that I think had a big influence on it are actually like books that I read in prep for Citizen Sleeper 1. So I'd say like the Becky Chambers books, those have a really strong kind of ship and crew like structure. I think they're really, really compelling and really nicely written, but very like emotionally rich, which is really nice for science fiction, I think. Gibson, I think an amazing book called Blackfish City, which is set on a kind of like, it's like a post-climate change oil platform that has become like a refugee settlement, and that became a big influence on the eye. But I think just Citizen Sleeper generally draws a lot on the kind of qualities that Blackfish City has, which is it's really like a deep appreciation of kind of ad hoc like urban environments combined with like multicultural and like refugee experience. And I think there's just like something really rich and interesting in that book that touches on those things. So I liked a lot of the atmospheres from that book and drew on that. And then also like a big kind of theoretical influence on Citizen Sleeper more generally is Anna Singh's Mushroom at the End of the World. I think that's the kind of like where I formulated the more theoretical and kind of like sociological, critical kind of view of Citizen Sleeper. So that book is all about mushrooms growing in the ruins of like devastated ecosystems, but it's very much about the structures that it talks about capitalism as a kind of core that we usually focus on, that also includes a vast periphery that we don't really focus on and we don't talk about as capitalism. So that's why it kind of draws on this idea of mushrooms growing in these devastated wildernesses where capitalism came and moved on, and then you have these economies that grow up around these mushrooms that are very ad hoc and very Anna Singh refers to them as assemblages. They're like a collection of like dysfunctional and functional systems overlapping each other. I think that was a massive inspiration for thinking about what kind of like the Helian system was and how I formulated this idea of a solar system that was once owned and like the kind of jewel in the crown of a corporation, and then that corporation collapsed and you have all of this like ruin and dysfunction, but you also have all of this potential and kind of like new realities coming into being, and that manifests so differently at so many different layers for characters. And yeah, that was I read that book and reread it quite a few times just because I really like the way that it both formulates the real kind of precarity and difficulties of experiencing life within capitalism, but it does so without kind of presenting just a purely like negative view. It presents like a hopeful, or perhaps like I don't know if it's even hopeful as much as it's just kind of like aware of the kind of things that grow in the wake of capitalism. And it's a book that's kind of excited about those, and I really like that.
Awesome. That sounds great. Thanks for that. What were some of the games that were formative for you in finding your kind of game design style and voice?
It's an interesting one that I think there's a kind of mix of voices for me in terms of games. I think, one thing that I really love and really started me making games was understanding the potential of games to evoke worlds with a very limited set of tools, especially with my first game. There's a really wonderful game called Duskers, where you play as like a drone operator in some kind of like post-apocalyptic like deep space situation, and you basically are desperately trying to survive on your spaceship by like sending your little drones into like derelict spaceships and retrieving gear. But the whole game is played implying that you yourself sat at the desk are like the drone operator sat at the desk in their ship. So you have like an interface on the screen that's the interface that the drone operator is using, and you're typing command line commands into a console to like send the drones around. You can't directly control them. You have to be like open door D6, and you have this like really grainy view of what the drones are doing. That's all through a map view, and it's so evocative and scary and cool. And what I love is it considers the player as part of the game. And that's something that I think constantly about. Even though my games maybe are not as explicitly doing that, I still really think a lot about what do I want the player to be doing or feeling, and what might they be saying like out loud to their screen while they're playing, or like things like this. That's a big part of my voice. And then I think a really influential game is a game called Diaries of a Spaceport Janitor. It's a little indie game where you play as a little sprite walking around this really colorful, busy, like beautiful, almost like a kind of Cartoon Network Star Wars like spaceport. And your job is to pick up trash and to incinerate it to get money. And this is the town where like all the adventurers come, and they go to like the dungeons, and they buy like expensive swords and expensive guns to go on these adventures. But you can't do any of that. You can go to those shops and like look at them, but they're too expensive to buy. And you're just living this like day-to-day life, but it has like days of the week, like fictional days of the week. And there's like a fictional like Friday night in that game, where like everybody goes out and parties and you're still going around picking up trash. And then the next day is always like a sad kind of like rainy Saturday where like there's all the trash left over from the parties. And it just has this incredible like nuance for depicting like human life, but within like a really kind of cartoony science fiction world. And that had a really big impact in me in the sense that I think for me, I've always been someone that really loves like literature and very, very like human scale work. And then also like another part of me just like loves science fiction and loves like Star Wars and like grand vistas and kind of like Star Wars like marketplaces, or like even fantasy story marketplaces like Hellboy 2's Troll Market or something, like all of this like richness. And I always felt like there's some kind of contrast between my interest in like science fiction and genre and then my interest in like much more human and like real literary stories. And I felt like Spaceport Janitor just kind of like smashed those two together for me. And I was like, oh, you can do both. You can tell like a really human story, and you can do it with like little pixel art versions of Star Wars characters, and it somehow comes off. And I don't think I would have like figured that out on my own, but playing that game I was like, oh, that's cool. I wonder if that's a space that like I can step into, and I can try to make work that exists within the science fiction genre, but actually like brings that kind of a literary sensibility to it. So that became really influential on me.
Yeah, I often love games that sort of have that juxtaposition of, maybe like cutesy or kind of cartoony kind of graphics, but they're really get really deep on like hardcore human emotion or themes. And it's just very satisfying. And I also love what you said earlier about like games that they almost feel like you're playing the game outside of the actual controls of the game, like games where you have to like actually like scribble things on a note to kind of figure things out. Like I think of like maybe like something like Return of the Obra Dinn, which is like a detective game I loved, where you really had to like piece things together outside of the game. So this is a question we ask every guest on the show. Is there a book that you think would make for a really interesting video game adaptation?
I have a really recent one, which is I've been reading Gog Magog and Ludluda, the new Jeff Noon books, and they're like this incredible fantasy version of London. It's like post-war London, but it's like weird fantasy because the River Thames is actually like the ghost of a great dragon, and the dragon is sick, and it's about a woman who's like traveling up the river with like a group of other people on the ship. And it's just so weird. I mean, Jeff Noon's writing, like, generally he's a very weird writer, but like it's got this incredible kind of richness to it. This idea of like traveling by boat up through the ghost of a dragon, and all the kind of different like strange places, like passing through the heart of the dragon, and it has certain things happen, or like passing through all the different body parts of inside this ghost, which is always this kind of intangible like fog that's kind of hanging over the river, but it's also like that becomes like stringy bits of flesh, or it becomes like bubbles, and if you like inhale the bubbles, you like get the dreams of the dragon. There's so much stuff going on, but it's all like focused within this like very kind of classic like journey up the river story. And I think that's the kind of thing that would be amazing to see in a video game. I'm a big fan of like new weird stuff anyway, like China Mayville as well, and Jeff Vandermeer. And I really feel like video games I'd love to see a new weird video game. I'd love to see someone do something that's like a bit more, where magic is just like that bit more unhinged. It's a bit more like a force in the world, and less like a kind of ability that you can control, and just have that kind of like slightly wilder version of magic and world building. That I'd love to see that happen.
We've gotten a lot of requests to have, because China Mieville is one of our authors that we publish,
right?
And we've gotten a lot of requests to have him play like Disco Elysium or something like that, some kind of like speculative fiction kind of D&D game.
It's true that Disco Elysium does have a strong new weird vibe in it, so that makes sense.
Awesome. So final question, do you have any advice for maybe aspiring game developers or game writers, or just maybe people who want to make a game that's kind of similar to Citizen Sleeper in terms of being like a small team and taking on a lot of that work yourself?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a real advocate for like just download the software and just get going, like just learn it. Like you don't need to know everything it does, you just need to be able to get it to do something. That's been my whole life, I think, since I like downloaded Photoshop at like 13, had no idea how to use it, and now like Photoshop is probably the program I've used throughout my entire life, just like nonstop. It's like almost like a second brain for me. It's where I like think up ideas, and it's just like, yeah, I think I think like you've got to like have a go. You've got to like download the software and go for it. But I think you've also got to consider what it is that you want to offer, because games are a really like they're a really varied structure, and you're going to build a machine when you build a game, and that machine will hopefully be kind of unique. And there's such an opportunity in that to build a machine around like you, if you want to, especially if you want to be a solo developer or a small team developer, to build it around your capabilities, your strengths, like the things that you're interested in. I think like In Other Words, my first game, I'm not a coder really, even though I make games. Like I use tools that stop me having to write code. And that game was very much formulated the idea, well, I know how to do graphic design, I know how to write, so let's make a UI game which is very text focused, and let's build on that and start there. And then also a big part of it was like, and also what am I super interested in, like what could I stand to make for 2 years of my life or 3 years of my life. And I was like, well, I've always loved marine biology, and I never got to study it. It's one of my obsessions that I didn't manage to pick up on. And so it's like, okay, well, if I'm making a game about an alien ocean, I've got to read lots of marine biology, right? And then use that to build my own biology in the game. And so yeah, I think if you can find something that you're really obsessed about and that you're really interested in, and then you can find the ways, like the skills you have that you could bring to that, then I think you can just, head in that direction. I think the best thing is not to try to then make, the perfect version of that, but just to make a version of that, to just do what you can and play to your strengths, and try to discover what it is that, what kind of games you make, rather than try to make somebody else's games. I think that's really important, and there's so much space in that for games. And I think as somebody who tried to like make a life as like an experimental writer, I think it's so much easier to make experimental work in games than it is in literature. I think it can be really hard to get people to read experimental books. So I think if you're interested in exploring experimental work, I think games is a really cool space for it.
Yeah, thank you for that. That's amazing. I totally agree too. I definitely think even if you're just kind of like perusing indie games on like a store or something, a lot of times just like looking at a screenshot can like immediately evoke that sense of like experimentalism or like innovation that it's very hard to do that with like a book or even like a movie or something.
Yeah, it's an inherent part of the form, really. It's a combination of the fact that, games were kind of built on novelty, and that novelty used to be like, oh, it looks more realistic. Oh, it's like bigger, it's better. But now we're like we've hit the point where that's not really that impressive anymore, and it's so expensive to do something impressive that only a few studios with thousands of people can do it. But that means there's a huge appetite for novelty in people who play games, and so they don't really mind if you offer, like with In Other Waters, right? The game is like, people loved it, but it's like it's just a UI. It's like flat, and people were saying like, "Oh, this game's like one of the best looking games I've seen." And it's like, yeah, but it's literally just 2 colors and it's flat. If you can do it with 2 colors and flat, then the trick is not that you need to throw loads of money at it. The trick is that you need novelty, you need new ideas, you need to find like how you can catch people, how you can interest them. So I think it's an inherent part of games, and I don't think it's going to change anytime soon.
Awesome. All right, well, Gareth, that was all the questions I had. Was there anything else that you wanted to mention that I didn't, or that we didn't cover?
No, not at all. Just, if people are curious, definitely check out Citizen Sleeper 2, obviously. But other than that, it was just nice to chat about this stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you so much for being here. So yeah, you heard it. Citizen Sleeper 2, Starward Vector, comes out January 31st. And yeah, I definitely recommend Citizen Sleeper 1 if you're interested in that too. It's an amazing, amazing game. Cool. Thank you so much, Gareth.
Thank you.